organisms deal with being preyed upon. And there are several, as you get larger, you get more ways to get away from predators. So most of what we talked about with the microbes was, there's a little bit of mechanical, but it's mostly chemical, like toxins. So you can either mechanical, chemical, or behavioral are the major groups. So mechanical, you can be either too small or too large. So, you know, elephants are primary consumers, but, you know, they're too big for lions to handle. Or you can be too small. Bacteria are so small they're very difficult to filter out of solution, and so they escape being eaten by that. Chemical, toxins, and we talked about this, you need to be a large food item relative to your predator. Otherwise you're just the chili and the enchilada, right? You know, a little bit of spice there, but it's not going to kill you. You need to, and that's an evolutionary thing. You don't want to waste energy making a toxin if nobody's gonna be poisoned by you. So you got to be real toxic, and you got to do it in a large amount. Or you can be really lousy food. So you can make yourself use a lot of recalcitrant carbon in your body, and if there's no nitrogen and phosphorus there, maybe it's not worth eating. Some of the filamentous algae are probably go this route. And then there's all kinds of cool behavioral responses that multicellular organisms that can start sensing things like changes in pressure, changes in water flux, hydrodynamic, chemical, and visual cues that different organisms use. One of the ways is, we've talked about several times, is to be able to grow spines or make yourself too big for the mouth parts to take in the prey. And this is actually an invasive species from Africa, Daphnia lumpolzi. And this is 1,000 microns here, right? So that's actually a millimeter. You can see these things. They're over a millimeter long. And they've come into lakes throughout this part of the world. And they can basically hang in there during times of the year when most of the Daphnia species don't. We have a strange situation here in Kansas in that we have a lot of reservoirs, but we don't really have evolutionary history, a long evolutionary history of there being lakes in this area other than some oxbows. Even with that, the zooplankton are fairly well adapted to dealing with predation pressure. So I had a student, Randy Bernot, that was interested in that. And he went in and looked at the different strategies that the species have in the reservoirs. And the two dominant species have different strategies to dealing with predation. One of the species of Daphnia will just basically reproduce sexually. And if we remember back when Daphnia reproduces sexually, it produces an amphibia that has a hard shell, essentially. So they reproduce parthenogenically as females repeatedly throughout the season. But then when they make males, they mate, and the amphibia is this resistant structure. And that resistant structure can stay in the lake sediments for a long period of time, certainly until the next year. But they've actually resuscitated some that were 100 years old. So one of the things to do is to say, okay, as the different species of fish come on and they reproduce and create their larvae, the larval fish are the ones that are really hitting the zooplankton hard, right? Because they eat much smaller prey. And this is even true for ones that turn into, like bass, or that turn into large piscivores. But when they're at their juvenile life stages, they're going to have to eat zooplankton to make it. And so when these things start reproducing, then the chemical signal comes up, and the zooplankton respond to that chemical signal. So one of the species just basically reproduces sexually, makes resting stages, and goes down into the bottom of the sediment until the next year, and then they repeat the cycle. The other species reproduces very quickly and at much smaller body size. So it essentially is so small that it's not good food for the predator. So it's an escape in size by being small, and then reproducing it at much more quickly, and so it hangs in the population that way. Now, when this Daphnia limnology comes in, it throws a wrench in that whole thing, because larger zooplankton are more efficient filter feeders than smaller zooplankton. They're able to physically just move more water and get more phytoplankton out, so they're much better competitors. So in the past, where this little zooplankton species was able to hang in there by reproducing quickly and staying small, now this very large one comes in. It's so big and spiny that the fish can't really eat it, and it takes over essentially the population. So we're seeing some big shifts that are going on, and this has all happened over the last 5 to 10 years in reservoirs in this region as this zooplankton is swept across the country. You know, was it going to have huge, major, disastrous effects on the ecosystem? Probably not, but it is another case, an example of invasive species causing a strong effect, a potentially strong effect. The other way of looking at this philosophically is that, look, these things are all reservoirs anyway, and they're just these sort of assemblages that have gotten thrown together over time, so they're not a natural assemblage to have around here anyway. So if it shifts, then you know what's the problem? You've taken over essentially a river, and you've made it so the riverine species are out of there. So that part, if you're trying to conserve native river species, putting a reservoir in is not a good thing. But as far as what's actually in the reservoir, it's not a natural situation for the most part anyway. So conceptually, how do you deal with that as a manager? Probably just try to get the species of fish that people want to catch and not have the water quality be too bad. So there's several behavioral responses that zooplankton have to predators as well, and this is fairly common. So we have on the x-axis just the number of individuals per liter, and on the y-axis we have depth, and this is a fairly deep lake where they did this sampling, and they just sampled every hour throughout a 24-hour period. What we see at 5 o'clock in the morning, that most of the population is up pretty close to the surface of the lake. And then as the day goes on and gets brighter, the population moves down deeper and deeper. So some of these things are swimming, 100 meters down, 300 feet down during the daytime. And they get dispersed down in these darker areas. And then at night, they come back up, and almost all of them have come up to the surface there. And this is an adaptation because most of the things that eat zooplankton are sight feeders. Most of these fishes, the bluegills and the crappies and those kinds of fish are really using sight to get at those centrarchids are using sight to get at those zooplankton. And so they go down during the day when there's a lot of light in the water and they can be seen, and then they go back up at night when the fish can't see them and get them. So they can get up where the algae are photosynthesizing and growing and eat them there, and then go back down again. And they're quite sensitive to light, and they have to be able to go this deep and still be able to have a positive phototaxis. So they've even done these measurements at times when there's a full moon versus when there's new moon, and they show that during the full moon they tend to stay down deeper and not come all the way up, but during the new moon they come all the way up to the surface. So it's a fairly complex adaptation. In addition to that, Daphnia some species of Daphnia actually have flocking behaviors, and so they act like flocks of birds basically, and they cluster together, and apparently this makes them so they're able to, when they start trying to escape from the predator, it makes it less likely that each individual will get eaten. So that's kind of a strange thing that you may not think would happen, but even for a fairly simple organism, they have fairly complex responses to behavior. Some of those then, now we've got a couple of different ways we've seen them mediate that. It turns out they use chemicals in the water to sense what's going on around them. So the one part of the story that I didn't tell you about these Daphnia species is the way that my student found this out was he just basically took water from an aquarium that had fish in it and was culturing these Daphnia, and he just put that water into the aquarium with the Daphnia, and the one species then started reproducing faster at smaller sizes, and the other ones reproduced sexually, just from being exposed to these chemicals created by these dominant fish species that are in the water. So they're sensing whether there's a predator around. Oftentimes they'll also respond to chemicals of crushed Daphnia as well, so if somebody's eating a bunch of Daphnia, then that will put them into some sort of protective mode. They're using light to see where they should be in the water column, and also to see if there's large objects, right? So you remember that we use a clear Van Dorn bottle because you catch less zooplankton if you use a colored Van Dorn bottle or a colored Schindler trap. They see a large object coming and they get out of the way. They move away from it before the object can eat them. Right? So there's a whole series of different adaptations that they have to avoid predation, even a fairly simple organism such as this. So I talked about this. They can dive or swarm in response to chemicals released when conspecifically crushed, and how they can reproduce diapause-ing eggs or reproduce more quickly. So these are the major points from that. So how do predators adapt? And basically a predator is going to be the most successful if it can maximize its net energy intake. So in some situations, you don't want to always be running around looking for food if you're not very good at catching that food, or if it's rare. So you have to decide over evolutionary time whether you adopt a hide and wait versus an active foraging approach. And we can have examples of fish species then that have adapted to being hide and wait or active foraging. So oftentimes salmonids or some of the large torpedo-shaped piscivores that swim a lot are actively foraging, going around trying to catch their prey. Other species, such as the pikes and the species that are sort of have a shorter body relative to the length and a big fin, they sit there in the macrophytes, coiled in an S shape, and if they see prey, then they lunge out and get it, and that big fin pushes, and they spring out and get it. So they sit and wait. So they're not burning energy, basically, while they're looking for food. Of course, you can have more, with fish have enough neural circuitry that they can be complex. They can decide, do they go out and actively forage, or do they sit and wait or do nothing? So at winter, when food is at low abundance, many species of fish are very difficult to catch because they just simply don't feed at all. It just makes more sense for them to just sit out of the way, not let bigger fish eat them, but just not eat much and make it all winter until it gets warm, light again, and the fire production picks up and their food is at higher amounts. So you can have a series of sensory adaptations, including, we talked about visual feeders, but the other thing that that organisms can do, fish in particular, is they can sense some things that we can't. So they have this lateral line system, and they can sense very slight changes in pressure. And these might be related to, say, a fish swimming nearby, that they don't have to actually see it, right? And they can sense very weak electrical fields with their sensory systems as well. And any animal that has neural circuitry is essentially creating an electrical field. So there's an example of the paddlefish, which have a very highly developed, it's not a snout, and it's a sensory paddle at the end of their nose, and it's got a huge number of nerves in it that sense electrical charges, and it can find a few Daphnia or a few copepods that can sense that small of a signal, basically. So those paddlefish are down there in those very turbid rivers, right? There's no light down there, so they have to rely on something else to search out their prey. And what those things are is they can find small invertebrates by just using that sensory appendage and find those and then eat them. so they see the world in a very different sense than we do. And then in addition to the electrical and mechanical, they can be very sensitive to chemical. And so the catfishes, and many of them are very, rely very heavily on odors or chemicals, and they have those barbels that can sort of sense things out in the world. And we can talk a little bit about how the different selective pressures leads to different numerical responses, and I'll put that up in a second. And then the other thing that happens is that you're always worrying about getting food, and then most organisms are also worrying about being food. And so there's this trade-off that gets into whether you sit and hide or you go out and forage as well. So that plays back into that. So we have these functional response curves, and I don't know, have you seen these in Fundamentals of Ecology? I don't know if they go over these or not, but it's a general idea that if we have a density of a prey population and we have the number of prey consumed, you have type 1 where you go up to some level and you satiate, type 2 where it kind of slowly saturates, or type 3 where you don't feed at really low concentrations and then you do feed and eventually you get saturated. So these all are somewhat reminiscent, probably this type 2 one, of what we saw already with Daphnia feeding as a function of concentration of the algal population, right? That the higher the density was, the more they fed, and up to a point, and then they could only eat so much, and so they just eat at their optimum rate. It's difficult to tell the difference between this type 1 and type 2 curve in reality because of the scatter points. When you see the real data, like if you go back and look at those Daphnia data, you'll see the points are scattered around enough it's hard to see the difference between us. This type 3 one's interesting. So what do you think's going on here? Why do you think there's very low prey consumption rate as opposed to contrasting these two strategies? Why would this type 3 be at all? Why wouldn't you always eat food if it's around, even if it's in very low concentrations? Yeah, it takes too much energy, right? And then at some point you just elect to say, forget it, I'm just going to sit here and not eat anything at all until the food concentration is high enough. Then I kick up my rates, right? So it's an adaptation. And then we can see what the proportion of the prey is consumed. In this example, a constant proportion of the prey is consumed. In this example, you get this decreasing function. And in this example, there's an optimum proportion of the prey that are consumed at some intermediate level. So you can see the effect on the prey population is variable depending upon which of these strategies the predators have to eat their food. So getting into some more data here, we have on the x-axis we have 3 different sizes of Daphnia. We have small Daphnia, medium, and large, 1.4 millimeters, being pretty small animal, and this being a really large Daphnia. And then we have 2 densities of prey that are being put in with bluegill, and the prey are the prey. There's 25 prey per bluegill or 300 prey per bluegill, and the proportion in the gut relative to the largest size class is. What we see is that when there's very few prey per bluegill, the bluegill take up basically anything they come across. They're not being picky, they're eating everything at equal abundance relative to what it is. And there's a proportion then this is just put in a proportion of relative to their density or their abundance of prey, basically that number is 1, that no matter when they come upon something, they eat it. Alternatively, if you have a very high density of food, then you start getting picky. You start eating the best food. The large prey, in this case, has a lot more caloric value. It takes a lot less energy to eat if you can get it, so you pick out the good stuff. In this case, you see that these small ones, there's a lot around them. They just basically ignore the small ones and go for the big ones. And then if it has a ratio relative to 1, it looks like what happens is they're not really totally ignoring the small ones. If they get one, they'll take it, but they're not actively seeking them out. As they're not rejecting them, but they're not actively hunting for them like they are for the larger prey. Okay, so there's a functional response of a larger animal. Now we already talked about how when Daphnia, the prey here, is filter feeding, it will also be selective in what food it eats. It'll eat higher quality food, it'll eat bigger food if it can. So it's then working its way up the food web. We see similar things as we saw when we're talking about the way small organisms interact with microbes and the way that fish are interacting with these crustaceans. There's a lot of non-lethal effects of predation as well. So many predators don't kill their prey, but can alter their survival. And the extreme case of this would be a parasite that basically doesn't completely kill its host. It just takes some off of it. And another example of this would be, we're thinking of predation in a general sense now, that herbivores are predators on plants. And many herbivores of large plants don't eat the whole thing. So anything that eats macrophytes won't eat the whole plant, but they'll cause damage to it. So then there can be some sort of complex things that start popping up when you have a couple of different types of prey, and they are related to the interplay between what a predator will eat and what your relative abundance is. So if you have, there are examples of where if you have two prey species, the predator will generally tend to specialize on one or the other. So essentially predators build up search images. They sort of say, okay, this is the food I'm eating, and they go after that. I mean, it's just the way people are even, you know, they just kind of, if you're looking for something, you're more likely to find it. And so they'll build up the search image and they'll eat it until most of it's gone. Well, the other prey species is being ignored at this point, so it's being spared. But once the level of that prey gets low enough, then the second prey species becomes perhaps more desirable, so the predator will switch to other prey species. Or those two prey species will be in slightly different habitats. You know, maybe we're talking about Daphnia that grows near the shore versus in the weeds versus a Daphnia species that's an open water species. And so the predator, in switching from one to the other, will allow both prey species to coexist. And so this is actually an indirect interaction where the prey species are benefiting another prey species, and it allows both of them to stay in the particular environment. So you can imagine that there's also animals that have complex behaviors also then have ways to avoid being eaten. So another thing that experimentalists have shown is that if you have a predator present, then the prey will be less likely to feed. And so they'll do these experiments like they'll have a stickleback, you know, a small fish, and they'll have tubes that have food in them, and then they'll have a bass, a predator behind a glass partition, or not able to get them, but obviously visible to the species. The stickleback, when the predator's not there, will go and take food from anywhere. But if the predator's there, then they'll only take, you know, run in and take the food that's the furthest from the predator, and they'll leave the other food. So they're continuously assessing what the risk is and the way they forage versus being eaten. So that's also a non-lethal effect of predation, because even if that predator is not eating its prey, it's decreasing the rate that it can feed at and making it so it can grow less rapidly.